There are people who cry at their spouse's funeral. And then there are people who spend that same time busy calculating how to strip clean the assets of the person who just died. They truly believe that a 72-year-old man who had just lost the wife he'd spent half a century with was weak prey, easy to manipulate. But they forgot one bloody rule of the business world. An old wolf may lose his mate, but he never loses his fangs. 3 days, just 3 days after Eleanor, my heart, closed her eyes forever. The wound in my chest hadn't even begun to scab over, and already the vultures had started circling. I stood buried in the darkness of the hallway, listening to the sharp, steel-edged click of high heels echoing through my wife's study. That room used to be filled with the gentle scent of chamomile tea and warm light. Now my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was tearing through it on her own authority, replacing everything with the coldness of power and ambition, not a single tear of sorrow, only the arrogance of someone who believed she had already claimed the throne. And then that sound rang out, the sound of a thick notebook being hurled straight to the bottom of a metal trash can, with a force that made my whole body go rigid. It was Eleanor's very first design notebook, the notebook in mustard yellow, faded with the years. The only thing that still held my wife's trembling handwriting from the winter nights of 1974 when we had nothing, splitting stale bread between us and sleeping on the cold concrete floor to build this $800 million empire. Vanessa threw it away without a moment's hesitation, casting aside the past, the sweat and blood of the very woman who had made her whole life possible, just to make room for expensive decorations, a dry, silent sound, and yet deafening. In that instant, every trace of a grieving widower's weakness completely evaporated from me. A brutal awakening struck straight into my mind. They didn't just want to seize Sterling Horizon, they wanted to erase every trace that Eleanor had ever existed. I did not scream. I did not rush in to confront her. In the world of predators, whoever reveals their anger first has already lost. I slowly stepped back into the darkness. Vanessa thought she had just thrown away a worthless piece of trash. She had no idea that the sound she'd just made was the sound of her own hand ringing the bell that would activate the most brutal death sentence of her life, hers and her cowardly husband's. Before I tell you how I set the perfect trap and how I crushed every single traitor right at the most powerful boardroom table in America, leave me a comment telling me where you're watching this video from. Hit like and subscribe. If you agree with me on one thing, family is never defined by a birth certificate. It must be defined by absolute loyalty. The accident happened 9 days after the funeral on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 93, and it happened to the one person in that house I still believed, without reservation, was innocent of everything unfolding around him. Leo, my grandson, 19 years old, a boy who still called me Grandpa Artie, in a voice that hadn't fully outgrown its teenage crack, who used to sit at Eleanor's drafting table as a child and draw buildings with crooked, impossible angles that Eleanor always insisted, with total sincerity, were structurally brilliant, hydroplaned into a guardrail on his drive back from campus that evening. I had spoken to him just that morning, a brief phone call about nothing important, about a professor he liked and a paper due the following week. And I remember thinking, hanging up the phone, how good it felt to hear something ordinary after 9 days of nothing but grief and quiet suspicion. By the time Vanessa's scream tore me out of my study, by the time we arrived at Massachusetts General, with our hearts lodged somewhere in our throats, the hospital's fluorescent lights too bright and too indifferent for the moment, Leo was already in a trauma bay, and a young doctor with exhausted eyes was telling us, in that flattened, urgent tone doctors use when every second actually counts, that Leo had lost a dangerous volume of blood and needed a transfusion immediately. "He's O negative," the doctor said, glancing between the three of us with the particular efficiency of someone who has delivered this exact sentence many times before and needs an answer now, not sympathy. Universal donor blood, which also makes him one of the hardest patients to receive for. Our reserves are critically low tonight after the highway pile-up on the other side of the city. If anyone here is compatible, we need you right now." Julian went the color of the hospital walls. "I can't," he said, and the crack in his voice had nothing to do with fear for his son. I'm AB positive." The doctor paused. It was small, professional, barely perceptible to anyone not watching as closely as I was. But I was watching. I have spent 40 years reading rooms for a living, watching for the half-second hesitation that tells you a deal is about to collapse before anyone in the room has said a single word out loud. And I saw that same flicker cross the doctor's face before he simply nodded, turned, and asked the nurse for the reserve inventory, moving on, because the boy on the table mattered more in that moment than whatever silent arithmetic had just crossed his mind. I am not a geneticist. I'm a builder, a negotiator, a man who has spent his life reading blueprints and balance sheets rather than biology textbooks. But even I remembered enough from a college course 50 years gone to understand one immovable fact. 2 parents whose blood types included AB positive did not, under the ordinary and unbending laws of human inheritance, produce a child who was O negative. This was not a matter of odds, of rare exceptions, of the kind of unlikely coincidence a family might laugh about at a holiday dinner years later. It was closer to arithmetic. It was closer to a locked door that had just quietly swung open in front of me, revealing a room I never wanted to see the inside of. I said nothing. I stood in the corner of that fluorescent hallway, one hand pressed flat against the cool wall, my heart hammering with a fear that had, sometime in the last 30 seconds, split cleanly into 2 entirely separate fears, one for Leo's life and one for a truth I could feel approaching like weather gathering on the horizon. I watched my son's face drain of color for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with saving his own child's life. I watched Vanessa's eyes dart, instinctively, involuntarily, toward the hallway entrance, toward Marcus Vance, our own chief legal counsel, who had, for reasons I hadn't yet thought to question, arrived at the hospital before I had, standing near the vending machines with the studied casualness of a man trying very hard to look like he belonged somewhere. He clearly did not. Nobody explained why the company's lawyer was standing in a hospital corridor at 11 o'clock at night for a family emergency that wasn't technically a company matter at all. Nobody offered an explanation, and I did not ask for one. I have learned over 4 decades of negotiation that the questions you choose not to ask out loud are sometimes the very ones that yield the most honest answers later, because the guilty always assume that silence means you simply haven't noticed. I filed the thought away, the way I file every observation that doesn't yet fit the larger pattern. React to the pattern, Eleanor used to tell me, her hand resting on my arm during some tense negotiation decades earlier, her voice low and certain. Never to the moment. The moment is designed to make you emotional. The pattern is the truth underneath it. The hours that followed were among the longest of my life, second only to the final weeks of Eleanor's illness. I sat in a plastic chair in that hallway, watching the clock above the nurse's station tick forward with agonizing slowness, watching Julian pace the length of the corridor without once looking in my direction, his hands jammed deep in his pockets, his shoulders drawn up around his ears like a man bracing for a blow he knew was coming from somewhere he couldn't see. I watched Vanessa dial her phone, and then, catching my eye, quietly put it away again, her thumb hovering over the screen for a half-second too long before she slid it back into her purse. I thought of every version of Leo I had ever known, the toddler who used to fall asleep on my chest during Sunday afternoons while the football game played quietly in the background, the boy who cried the entire way home from his first day of kindergarten because he'd forgotten his favorite pencil on his desk and was convinced it would be lost forever, the teenager who spent an entire summer building an elaborate treehouse in our backyard using scrap lumber from a Sterling Horizon job site, insisting with his grandmother's exact stubbornness that he didn't need help, even when the whole structure listed visibly to one side. And the young man who had, just weeks earlier, helped me carry Eleanor's casket alongside men 3 times his size, his jaw set with a grief far too heavy for someone his age, his hand finding my shoulder afterward in a gesture that felt, unlike his father's, entirely and uncomplicatedly real. Whatever secrets this family was hiding, I told myself, sitting in that unforgiving plastic chair, with the smell of antiseptic thick in the air, they were not going to cost this boy his life. Not tonight, not on my watch. Whatever else I might discover in the days ahead, whatever betrayals were still waiting to surface, Leo himself was not a piece on anyone's board. He was simply a boy who loved his grandmother's drafting table and had the terrible misfortune of being born into a family that had already begun, quietly and methodically, devouring itself from the inside. Leo pulled through. Compatible donor blood arrived from a partner hospital 40 minutes later, rushed across town by a courier who, I later learned, ran 2 red lights to make it in time. And by dawn, Leo was stable, sleeping, his young face slack and peaceful in a way that made him look, for just a moment, exactly like the boy who used to fall asleep drawing crooked buildings at his grandmother's drafting table, entirely unaware that the machinery of his family's secrets had shifted an entire turn while he lay unconscious in that hospital bed. I sat beside him until sunrise, holding his hand, listening to the steady, reassuring beep of the monitor, watching the pale gray light of morning slowly fill the window and spread across the thin hospital blanket covering his legs. I made myself a quiet, private promise in that room, one I did not share with anyone, not even the nurse who came in periodically to check his vitals and change the bag on his IV line. Whatever truth was buried beneath this family, I would find it, before it found me first, and certainly, absolutely, before it ever found him. Leo had not asked to be born into whatever storm was brewing above his head. He deserved, at the very least, a grandfather who was willing to walk directly into that storm on his behalf, rather than waiting quietly on the shore for it to pass and hoping the damage wouldn't reach the people he loved most. By the time the sun was fully up over the parking structure outside his window, I had already made a decision that would define everything that came after. I would not confront anyone yet. I would not raise my voice, demand answers, or let a single flicker of suspicion show on my face. I would watch. I would gather. I would become, for as long as it took, the very last thing any of them expected me to be, patient. A grieving old man, they believed, was easy to fool. They had no idea that grief and patience, in the right hands, could sharpen into something far more dangerous than either alone. 3 days after Leo came home, weak but recovering, I returned to Sterling Horizon's headquarters for the first time since the funeral, expecting nothing more than the ordinary friction of a company adjusting to loss. Condolences from the receptionist, a stack of deferred correspondence, the particular hushed quiet of an office that has learned to tiptoe carefully around its founder's grief. I remember pausing outside the glass doors for a moment before entering, looking up at the Sterling Horizon name etched into the stone above the entrance, the same stone Eleanor had personally selected from a quarry in Vermont because she said the color reminded her of the concrete floor we used to sleep on, a private joke between the two of us that nobody else in the company ever understood. My executive key card failed at the private elevator bank. I tried it twice, calmly, the way a man tries a key he assumes simply needs a firmer hand or a cleaner swipe. And on the third failure, Marcus Vance appeared in the lobby as though he had been standing there the entire time, waiting for the exact sound of my frustration, his timing so precise it would have almost impressed me under any other circumstances. "Arthur," he said, all smooth apology and no real warmth, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture that felt, in retrospect, like the practiced condolence of a man who had rehearsed it in a mirror that morning. I should have called you myself. Julian authorized a full security overhaul last week, protecting sensitive data while you're away from the office. Grieving. It's precautionary, that's all. Standard protocol for any transition period. I'll have it issue you a new badge by end of day, I promise you. I thanked him. I even managed something resembling a smile, the same practice smile I had once used across 100 negotiating tables to buy myself 30 seconds of thought while an opponent believed they had already won the room. I stood in that lobby a moment longer than necessary, watching him walk away, noting the small, satisfied set of his shoulders, the walk of a man who believed he had just successfully managed an old fool. Then I went home, sat alone in my study with the lights off for a long while, listening to the house settle around me, the old radiators ticking as they warmed, and did something I had not done in over a decade. Long before Sterling Horizon had a cybersecurity department, long before firewalls and compliance officers and the modern architecture of corporate secrecy that Marcus Vance had apparently just weaponized against me, I had personally overseen the installation of our very first servers, back when the company was small enough that I still knew the name of every single employee's spouse and could recite our entire client list from memory. Out of an old builder's habit of never trusting a structure I hadn't load-tested myself, I had built a private administrative backdoor into that original system, one so old, so thoroughly buried beneath 3 decades of subsequent upgrades and rewrites that no security consultant hired in the last 15 years would ever think to search for it, because none of them knew it had ever existed in the first place. I sat in my home office at 2 a.m, the blue glow of the monitor the only light in the house, my hands hovering over the keyboard the way they had 30 years earlier, when I first wired that system together with an electrician friend and an entire case of bad coffee between us, both of us laughing about how absurd it was that a small logistics and design outfit would ever need something this elaborate. I typed credentials that had not been used since before Leo was even born. The screen flickered. Loaded. Let me in. What I found in the hours that followed was not carelessness. It was architecture, deliberate, patient, and cruel, built with the same methodical precision Eleanor and I had once used to build the company itself, except turned inward now, like a parasite that had somehow learned to mimic its own host's blueprints, wearing the company's own language and structure as camouflage. $12 million drained from the employee pension fund over 18 months, laundered through a chain of shell entities disguised as architectural consulting contracts, consultants who did not exist, for buildings that were never designed, invoiced in careful, unremarkable increments small enough to avoid triggering any automatic review, paid out to accounts that traced, layer by patient layer, straight to Marcus Vance, and through a joint holding account I very nearly missed on my first pass through the ledgers, to Vanessa herself. I read each invoice twice, then a third time, my hand trembling slightly, not from age but from the particular fury of watching a lie built with genuine craftsmanship, the kind of craftsmanship I might have admired in any other context, and the special proxy resolution still sitting untouched on my desk downstairs. The one, Vanessa had told me, with tears glistening in her eyes, was purely about voting stability during my grief, was not, I discovered buried deep in an earlier draft preserved in the server's version history, what she had claimed it was at all. Beneath the polished language of temporary transition sat its true legal mechanism, an audit waiver, a clause that would strip the company's obligation to complete its scheduled financial review before the Securities and Exchange Commission's year-end filing deadline, a deadline that was, I now calculated with a cold, sinking certainty, less than 3 weeks away. They needed my signature, not for stability, to buy themselves enough time to bury $12 million missing dollars before it became impossible to hide from a federal regulator who would not care, even slightly, how recently I had buried my wife. I sat back in my chair and stared at that number until it stopped looking like a figure on a screen, and started looking like a face. Every retired foreman who had shaken my hand with genuine gratitude at his retirement party. Every widow of a Sterling Horizon architect who had once called to thank me personally when her husband's pension check arrived precisely on time. Every loyal employee whose 30 years of quiet trust had been liquidated, dollar by dollar, to fund somebody else's greed, while I stood at a graveside, entirely oblivious to what was happening behind my back. I thought about a man named Everett Dukes, who had run our loading operations for 29 years and had once driven 3 hours through a snowstorm to personally deliver blueprints I'd forgotten at the office, purely because he knew how much the deadline mattered to me. Men like Everett had trusted this company with their futures. I would not let that trust become collateral damage in someone else's greed. I thought of the mustard yellow notebook still sitting on the corner of my desk, rescued now from that wastebasket. I thought of Leo's blood type and the arithmetic that simply did not add up, no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind. I thought of Marcus Vance, standing in a hospital hallway he had no business being in, offering me a warm smile in a lobby the very next morning, as though nothing at all had changed between us, as though he hadn't just spent the previous night watching a 19-year-old boy's life hang in the balance for reasons that had nothing to do with the boy himself. I closed the laptop. I did not sleep that night. I sat instead at the window of my study, watching the streetlights flicker against the wet pavement outside, thinking of Eleanor's voice, of the 1,000 small negotiations we had survived together over 4.5 decades, of how she used to say that the numbers never lie, only the people standing next to them do. I thought about the particular way she used to squeeze my hand under a conference table whenever she sensed I was about to lose my temper in a negotiation, a small, silent reminder that patience was always the sharper weapon. I did not have her hand to squeeze mine that night. I had only her voice, remembered, and it was enough to keep me steady. By morning, when the sun finally came up over a city that had no idea what had just been uncovered inside one quiet house on a tree-lined street, I was no longer a grieving old man wondering helplessly what had happened to his family. I was a man building a case, and a man building a case, I have learned across 40 years of hard-won experience, does not sleep. He gathers. He waits. He lets the guilty believe, for just a little while longer, that they have already won, because nothing makes a predator more careless than the taste of an easy victory they believe is already secured. I made a pot of coffee I never drank, and I began writing a list on a yellow legal pad, the same brand Eleanor had always favored for her own sketches, dividing the page into 2 columns, what I knew and what I still needed to prove. It was, I realized somewhere around 4 in the morning, the same method she and I had used decades earlier to plan our very first building, back when the only capital we had was patience, stubbornness, and each other. Some habits, it turns out, outlive the people who taught them to us. I hired a man named Wallace Rios, a retired FBI financial crimes investigator who had spent 26 years dismantling exactly the kind of quiet, well-dressed fraud that had apparently been dismantling my family from the inside for years, one careful transaction at a time. A mutual acquaintance from the banking world had given me his number with a single line of introduction. If the money's hiding, Wallace finds where it's sleeping. I told him everything, sitting across from him in a coffee shop far from downtown Boston, where nobody would recognize either of our faces. The missing notebook, the failed key card, the impossible blood type, the audit waiver disguised as a stability measure for a grieving family. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook that I noticed with a small, painful pang I didn't expect was almost the exact color of Eleanor's own. He told me, in his flat and unhurried voice, that he would have answers within the week. He needed 5 days. Those 5 days were, in some ways, harder to survive than the ones immediately following Eleanor's death. Grief, at least, has a shape you can learn to carry. Waiting for the confirmation of a betrayal you already suspect has no shape at all. It simply sits in your chest like a stone that grows heavier with every hour, every ordinary family dinner you sit through, pretending not to notice the tension humming beneath the surface. Every time Vanessa smiled at me across the table, and I found myself wondering, for the first time in my life, whether every smile she had ever given me had been exactly this calculated. The first thing Wallace confirmed nearly stopped my heart entirely, though by then some part of me had already known it in my bones, had known it since that hospital hallway. A discreet DNA comparison, taken from a coffee cup Marcus Vance had carelessly left behind in a conference room during a routine visit, and compared against a sample Wallace had quietly obtained through channels he did not elaborate on and I did not ask about, from Leo's hospital chart, confirmed what the blood type had only suggested. Marcus Vance was Leo's biological father. Vanessa and Marcus had known each other since college, Wallace explained, laying photographs and printouts across my desk with the careful, unhurried patience of a man who had delivered devastating news many times before and understood that speed, in moments like this, was not a kindness. Long before Vanessa had ever met my son, she and Marcus had been something to one another, a relationship abandoned on paper and quietly resumed in secret, never truly ended, merely paused and carefully repositioned. Wallace found the whole trail, hotel receipts spanning years, encrypted messages recovered from an old cloud backup Vanessa had forgotten was still quietly syncing to a device she thought she had wiped clean, a pattern reaching back more than 2 decades that read, in aggregate, less like an affair and more like a long, patient plan. Vanessa had not married into my family by accident. She had been placed there, deliberately, the way a chess player positions a piece 3 moves before the opponent even notices that the board has changed shape entirely. I sat very still as Wallace spoke, my hands folded on the desk in front of me, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to receive this the way I had trained myself to receive bad news across 1,000 boardroom negotiations, without flinching, without giving away, even to the man I was paying to tell me the truth, how deeply it was cutting. I thought absurdly of the day Julian had first brought Vanessa home to meet us, of how charmed Eleanor had been by her, how she had squeezed my hand under the dinner table that night and whispered that she thought this one might finally be good for our son. Eleanor had never been wrong about people. It was perhaps the single greatest mercy of her passing that she never had to learn how wrong she had been about this one. But it was the second thing Wallace found that broke something in me I did not know could still break. Something I had genuinely believed grief had already hollowed out entirely, leaving nothing left to shatter. 22 years earlier, a young Julian Sterling had been treated at a private clinic in Connecticut for a medical condition that had left him permanently, irreversibly unable to father children. The records were sealed, private, protected by decades of medical confidentiality law. The kind of thing a frightened 23-year-old man might bury so deep, might refuse to speak of even to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts, that he eventually told himself, over the passing years, that it had never happened at all. My son had always known Leo was not his blood, and he had said nothing, not out of love, not out of some misguided, forgivable instinct to protect a child who deserved better than a complicated truth, but because he understood, with the same cold precision his wife had used to draft a fraudulent proxy resolution, that Eleanor's original estate provisions tied significant portions of the family inheritance directly to Sterling bloodline. Julian had built his entire adult life, the house, the standing, the comfortable, silent cowardice of pretending year after year, family dinner after family dinner, birthday after birthday, every single first day of school, and graduation and holiday morning, on a lie he chose, actively and deliberately, every single day, because the truth would have cost him a kingdom he had never actually earned in the first place, only inherited by accident of birth and preserved ever since through deceit layered upon deceit. I asked Wallace to leave me alone with the files for a while. He nodded, gathered his coat, and let himself out without another word. The particular courtesy of a man who understood exactly what kind of silence a person needs after hearing something like this. I sat alone in my home office long after he left. The printout spread across the desk where Eleanor used to sit beside me, reviewing blueprints late into the night, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, arguing cheerfully with me about load-bearing walls and window placement until well past midnight. I did not weep. I had wept enough at the cemetery, enough in the long years of watching her fight an illness she never once complained about, not even on her worst days, days when I know now, looking back, that the pain must have been nearly unbearable. What I felt now, staring at those sealed clinical records, was colder than grief, and infinitely more useful to the task ahead of me. I thought about every year Julian had let this lie stand between us, every Thanksgiving, every quiet moment when I had watched him with Leo and felt something swell in my chest that I now understood he had in some private corner of himself known was built on sand. I thought about how many times I had told him, over the years, how proud I was of the family he had built, and how many times he must have absorbed that pride knowing exactly how false its foundation truly was. Somewhere in that house full of people wearing my family's name, a predator had walked in decades ago, patient and unhurried, content to wait an entire generation for his moment, and everyone who should have stopped him, everyone who had the power to say something, anything, at any single point along that long and quiet timeline, had instead decided it was easier, more comfortable, and considerably more profitable to simply let him stay. I thought of Leo's face in that hospital bed, peaceful and unaware. I thought of the small, crooked buildings he used to draw at his grandmother's drafting table, buildings that would never have existed if Marcus Vance had simply stayed a stranger. None of this was his doing. None of it was his fault. And yet he stood without knowing it, directly in the blast radius of everyone else's carefully constructed lies, a boy who had done nothing except exist, and who would now have to carry a truth none of the adults around him had ever found the courage to tell him themselves. The old wolf, I understood, staring at those papers until the desk lamp burned my tired eyes and the first gray light of morning crept beneath the curtains, had been asleep for far, far too long. It was time to hunt, not out of vengeance alone, though vengeance was certainly present, sitting quietly in my chest like a stone I had been carrying since the funeral, but out of something closer to duty, the duty of a man who still had one true grandson left standing in the wreckage, and a legacy built by a woman who deserved far better than to have her name used as camouflage for a crime this ugly. I picked up the mustard-yellow notebook from the corner of my desk, held it for a long moment in both hands, and made myself a second promise to add to the first. Whatever it cost me, I would make sure that when this was over, Eleanor's name stood for exactly what she had built it to stand for, and nothing else. I called Julian and Vanessa to the house 3 nights later, and I gave the performance of my life. A performance built, I would later realize, entirely out of the negotiating instincts Eleanor had spent 40 years sharpening in me. Instincts I now turned for the very first time in my life against my own blood. I let my shoulders sag the moment they walked through the door. I let my hands tremble as I poured a glass of water at the sideboard, letting the glass clink against the pitcher just loudly enough to sound like an old man's genuinely unsteady hands, rather than a deliberate performance rehearsed alone in front of a mirror the night before. I told them, in a voice thinned by manufactured exhaustion, that they were right, that the grief was too much, that the company needed steady hands, that I was tired in a way I hadn't allowed myself to admit since Eleanor died, tired in the particular bone-deep way that made even simple decisions feel like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. I told them I would sign everything Friday morning in front of the full board, so there would be no question of legitimacy later, no whispered doubts among the shareholders about whether an old man had been quietly coerced in the privacy of his own living room. I watched relief wash over Vanessa's face like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, watched the careful mask she wore slip, just for a moment, into something genuinely, unguardedly triumphant. I understood in that exact instant exactly how many times before this she had watched someone else believe her lies and felt this same warm, private triumph. How practiced, how well-worn this particular feeling must have been for her by now, after 2 decades of getting away with it. Julian, for his part, exhaled audibly, his whole body loosening, and reached over to squeeze his wife's hand in a small gesture of shared relief that told me everything I still needed to know about which of the two of them had truly been driving this scheme, and which had simply been dragged along behind her, too weak or too frightened to resist. They did not wait for Friday to begin celebrating. Within 48 hours, 3 of Sterling Horizon's most loyal senior directors, men and women who had worked beside Eleanor and me since our earliest, leanest years, who had stood beside us at groundbreakings when we barely had enough capital to finish pouring the first floor, who had helped build this company brick by literal brick, when brick was, quite literally, all we had to our name, received termination notices signed under Julian's newly asserted authority, delivered by a junior HR associate too frightened of losing her own job to question the sudden paperwork stacking up on her desk. I heard about it from one of them directly, a woman named Patricia Alden, who had been Eleanor's first hire, and had cried on the phone telling me not because she had lost her position, she said, but because she couldn't understand what she had possibly done to deserve it after 28 years of loyal service. Vanessa began meeting with an interior designer to discuss modernizing the executive floor, ordering swatches of the very same steel gray she had already used to gut Eleanor's study, sketching a future for my company that erased room by room, floor by floor, every trace of the woman who had actually built it from nothing. They were not merely counting their winnings in advance. They were already spending them, already redecorating a kingdom they did not yet legally own and might never own at all, moving through the halls of my company with the easy confidence of people who had already forgotten there was anyone left standing between them and everything they wanted. While they celebrated, I worked. Wallace and my attorneys spent those same 48 hours in direct, secure coordination with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, laying every single piece of evidence: the Shell consulting contracts, the offshore transfers, the falsified audit waiver, the drained pension fund, the forged authority behind Julian's sudden termination spree, the paternity records, every last thread of it, into a case file thick enough to end careers and very likely end freedoms for a very long time. I authorized the quiet freezing of every offshore account Wallace had traced, moving with a lawyer's patience and a builder's precision, sealing every possible exit before the trap ever needed to spring shut, working through nights that blurred together into a single long, unbroken vigil at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had once spread blueprints across the surface instead of federal case files. I thought more than once during those sleepless hours of Eleanor, of the mustard yellow notebook, finally rescued from that wastebasket and sitting now permanently on the corner of my desk where I could see it every single time I looked up from the case files spread out in front of me. I thought of the young woman who had once told me, over a card table doubling as our very first office desk, in a rented room above a hardware store on a street that no longer exists, that a building is only as strong as the people who refuse to let it be built on a lie. I finally understood in full exactly what she had meant, all those years later, in a way I never could have understood it back when she first said it to me. Both of us 26 years old and terrified of failing, huddled over that same card table with nothing but ambition and each other. There were moments, I will admit, when the weight of what I was doing nearly stopped me. Julian was still my son. Whatever he had become, whatever cowardice and greed had hollowed him out into over the years, some small, stubborn part of me kept returning to memories of a boy on my shoulders at a construction site, laughing, utterly fearless, before the world ever taught him to be anything else. A boy who once insisted on wearing his tiny plastic hard hat to school picture day because he wanted, more than anything, to grow up and build things exactly the way his father did. I let myself feel that grief fully, once alone in my study at 3 a.m, sitting with a framed photograph of Julian at 7 years old, dust jacket pockets stuffed with pine cones he'd collected from the job site that afternoon. And then I folded it carefully away, the way Eleanor used to fold away her own doubts before a difficult negotiation. And I kept working, because the alternative, letting sentiment stop me, would have meant letting $12 million of stolen retirement money simply vanish into an offshore account forever, and letting the people responsible for it walk free to do it again to someone else's family. I called Wallace at 4 a.m. on Thursday, unable to sleep, and asked him a question I hadn't planned to ask. "Do you ever get used to this part?" I said, "watching people you're about to destroy while they have no idea it's coming?" He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "No," he said. "You just get better at remembering they built the trap themselves. You're only closing the door they already walked through." By Thursday night, the trap was completely set. Every account frozen, every document verified, every federal agent briefed and ready to move at a moment's notice. And on Friday morning, I dressed carefully, chose my oldest and most familiar suit, the one I had worn to more difficult negotiations than I could count, the one Eleanor had once teased me for refusing to replace, even after the lapels had gone out of fashion twice over, and walked into the Sterling Horizon boardroom, not as a broken old man leaning on his son's mercy, but as the founder who had built every single wall in that room with his own 2 hands, a man who intended to make absolutely certain it still stood long after the people trying to steal it were gone, forgotten, or sitting in a federal courtroom answering for what they had done. I stopped for a moment in the elevator on the way up, alone, watching the floor numbers climb, and I allowed myself one final memory before the doors opened. Eleanor, standing in the unfinished lobby of this very building 30 years earlier, running her palm flat along a section of exposed concrete and telling me with absolute certainty that someday this would be a place where people felt safe enough to do their best work. I did not know, riding up in that elevator, whether I could still promise her that. But I knew, with the same certainty she had once carried, that I was about to try, and that I would not stop trying until every last person, still loyal to what we had built, could once again walk through these doors without fear. The boardroom was cold that morning, not merely in temperature, though Vanessa had insisted weeks earlier on lowering the thermostat to something more befitting her redesigned aesthetic, but in the particular way rooms turn cold when the people inside them are calculating rather than feeling, when every smile around the table is measuring distance rather than offering warmth. Vanessa sat in the chair at the head of the table, my chair, the one Eleanor had once teased me for being far too sentimental about, the one with a small worn patch on the left armrest from 4 decades of my own hand resting there during long negotiations, and slid a gold-plated pen across the polished surface toward me with 2 fingers, the way one might slide a chip across a card table toward a man they believed had already lost. Julian stood near the window, unable to fully meet my eyes, the posture of a man who had spent 22 years perfecting the art of never looking directly at his own conscience and was now discovering far too late that the habit had quietly atrophied something essential in him. Marcus Vance sat 2 seats down, his suit immaculate, his expression composed into exactly the kind of practiced neutrality I imagine he had used in 100 depositions, though I noticed, if I looked closely enough, the faint sheen of sweat gathering at his temple, despite the cold air Vanessa had insisted upon. The room waited. I could hear the second hand of the antique clock on the far wall, the one Eleanor had bought at an estate sale the year we opened our second office, insisting a proper company needed a proper clock to mark its proper hours. Ticking through the silence like a held breath, each second stretching a little longer than the last, the whole room suspended in a stillness that felt, to me, almost holy. The particular stillness that exists in the last moment before something irreversible happens. I did not pick up the pen. I reached instead for my wristwatch, unclasped it slowly, deliberately, and set it down on the table beside the folder they wanted me to sign, the metal clicking softly against the mahogany surface. It was a small, deliberate gesture, and I watched it register on Vanessa's face, the flicker of confusion at a man who was supposed to be too exhausted, too broken, to notice the details of his own hands. "Do you know?" I said, my voice quiet enough that everyone in that room had to lean slightly forward to hear it, the way a room always leans forward for a man who no longer needs to raise his voice to be believed. What a thief's greatest weakness is. It's the assumption that the homeowner is asleep. Vanessa's smile faltered, the first genuine crack I had seen in weeks, small but entirely unmistakable, like a hairline fracture spreading slowly across polished glass. The door opened before she could respond. My head of internal security, a man who had worked for Eleanor and me for 11 years and whose loyalty, unlike so much else in that room, had never once wavered in all that time, stepped inside and closed the door behind him, sealing the room shut with a soft, final click that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. My attorney followed a step behind him, and instead of tossing stolen documents onto the table for cheap dramatic effect, he laid down something far more devastating in its quiet legality. A court-ordered medical disclosure, obtained through entirely proper legal channels once paternity fraud tied to inheritance rights had crossed into the realm of provable, actionable fact, revealing Julian's 22-year-old sealed clinical records for the entire room to finally see. I watched Julian's face as the papers hit the table. I had expected shock or perhaps anger, but what I saw instead was something closer to relief, the exhausted, almost grateful relief of a man who had been carrying a lie so long that its exposure, however catastrophic, felt lighter than one more day of holding it up alone. At the same moment, every monitor in that boardroom, the ones Vanessa herself had installed for her sleek, modern presentations, the very ones she had once used to unveil her renovation plans to an impressed room of executives, flickered to life with a single unified feed. Federal transaction records, the frozen offshore accounts, the Shell consulting contracts, $12 million traced, dollar by dollar, transfer by transfer, straight back to Marcus Vance and Vanessa Sterling, laid bare on every screen in the room for anyone present to read for themselves. Marcus Vance's composure finally broke entirely at the sight of his own name scrolling across the screen beside a dollar figure that would define the rest of his life. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, Vanessa looked down toward the lobby far below, and I watched the exact instant her composure shattered entirely. 3 unmarked federal vehicles pulling into the circular drive, agents already moving toward the building's entrance with the unhurried certainty of people who know precisely how the next 10 minutes are going to unfold, who have made this exact walk 100 times before and no longer need to hurry through it. The agents entered the boardroom 4 minutes later. They read Marcus Vance his rights first, federal wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud an employee pension fund, his practiced courtroom composure evaporating in real time into something far more human and far more frightened, his hands trembling visibly as an agent guided them gently behind his back. He looked in that moment nothing like the confident lawyer who had smiled at me in the lobby days earlier, all smooth apology and no real warmth. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had spent 2 decades building a life on borrowed time, finally out of it. Vanessa did not run, though I could see in the rigid set of her shoulders that some cornered animal part of her was still calculating the distance to the door, running the numbers one last time, the way she had run every other number in this scheme. There was, by that point, nowhere left in the world to run toward. She turned to look at me once, directly, and for a brief moment I saw something almost like genuine curiosity in her expression, as though she were trying, even now, to understand exactly how a grieving old man had managed to outmaneuver her. I offered her no explanation. Some questions, I decided, she could spend the next 15 years answering for herself. Julian, for his part, did not defend her. He did not defend himself either. He simply sank into the nearest chair and put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a grief that, for the first time in weeks, looked entirely genuine to me. And for one brief, unwelcome moment, I almost felt something for him. Then I remembered 22 years of a chosen, comfortable lie told over 1,000 family dinners, every Christmas morning, every birthday candle blown out over a cake, and the feeling passed like weather, leaving nothing behind but clear, cold sky. "One more thing," I said, once the agents had led Marcus toward the elevator, Vanessa following behind him in the terrible, humiliated silence of a woman who has finally, completely run out of scripts, her heels no longer clicking with confidence, but scraping unevenly against the marble floor. I reached into my jacket and withdrew a second document. Not evidence this time, but consequence, plain and simple. "The house you've been renovating," I said to Julian, who finally looked up at me, hollow-eyed and almost unrecognizable, a stranger wearing 40 years of my memories on his face. "The one where your wife threw your mother's notebook in the trash before Eleanor had even been in the ground 2 full weeks. That house, like nearly everything you believed belonged to you, was purchased through a corporate trust tied directly to your continued good standing at this company. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your employment at Sterling Horizon has been terminated for cause. The trust is now in default. You have until Monday to vacate the property." He did not argue. There was, by then, nothing left inside him to argue with. He simply sat there, alone in a room full of empty chairs, watching the last of a life he had never truly earned dissolve around him like smoke rising off a fire that had finally, after 22 years, burned itself all the way down to the ground. I stood at the head of that table for a long moment after everyone else had gone. The agents, the attorneys, my own security chief offering a quiet nod before slipping out to let me have the room alone. I looked around at the steel-gray walls Vanessa had insisted upon, at the cold, sterile design that had replaced every trace of warmth this room once held, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised even me, that the first thing I would do once the dust settled was tear every inch of it back out. Eleanor had built this company on the belief that a room should feel like it was listening to the people inside it. It was time finally to let it listen again. The fallout, once it began, moved with the terrible efficiency of a story too large to contain. The Boston financial press ran the headlines within hours. Pension fraud, forged authority, a family empire nearly stolen out from beneath its dying matriarch's memory. Reporters called the house so often that I finally had to change the number, and for a week or two I found myself, an old man who had spent his career avoiding the spotlight, staring out at a small cluster of news vans parked at the end of my driveway, their satellite dishes tilted toward the sky like strange metal flowers. Marcus Vance's law license was suspended before his arraignment had even concluded. Vanessa was denied bail. The prosecution's case, built on Wallace Reyes's meticulous documentation, was airtight enough that even her formidable defense team could only manage to argue for leniency in sentencing, not innocence in fact. In the end, both Marcus and Vanessa were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, the exact machinery of consequence that people like them always assume exists for other people, and never for themselves, until the day it finally, inevitably, does. Julian disappeared from Boston's social circles within a week. His club membership was quietly revoked. a form letter arriving with the same bureaucratic coldness he had once used to sign my loyal director's termination notices. Friends who had spent a decade accepting his dinners stopped returning his calls entirely, their silence louder than any confrontation could have been. In a turn of poetic irony I neither engineered nor entirely disliked, he eventually took a laborer's position at one of Sterling Horizon's own construction sites, the same tower he had once toured wearing a tailored suit as its vice president. Admiring the view from the executive floor, now walked in a hard hat, hauling materials under the same unforgiving sun that had once merely warmed his office windows through tinted glass. I heard from the site foreman that he worked hard, kept his head down, and never once mentioned his last name to any of the men beside him. I did not go looking for him. I did not need to. He came to me instead 3 weeks later in the middle of an early winter storm, soaked through a jacket far too thin for the weather, standing on the porch of the small house I had moved into after selling the estate Vanessa had gutted of every memory that mattered, the wind driving sheets of freezing rain nearly sideways across the yard. He did not ask for money. He did not, to his credit, try to rewrite the story of his own cowardice into something more forgivable. He simply stood there, shivering, water dripping from his hair, down the collar of his ruined jacket, and said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For all of it. For Mom's notebook. For Leo. For not being the son you needed me to be." I looked at him for a long moment, this stranger wearing my son's face, and I found to my own quiet surprise that I did not feel the cold satisfaction I had once, weeks earlier, expected to feel in this exact moment. I felt only a tired, complicated sorrow, the particular grief of watching someone you love become a cautionary tale you never wanted to have in your family, the kind of story parents whisper to their own children as a warning rather than a memory. "I can't give you back what you threw away," I told him, my voice steady, despite the storm howling around us both. "Nobody can do that for you, but there's a difference between a man who lies to keep what was never his and a man who tells the truth, even when it costs him everything. You have exactly one chance left to find out which one you actually are." I did not invite him inside that night, but I did not close the door on him forever either. Some doors, I have learned, are better left ajar, not because the person on the other side has earned forgiveness, but because the alternative is becoming someone who has forgotten how to offer it at all, someone whose own heart has hardened into the same kind of stone that ruined the people who hurt him. Over the months that followed, Julian and I began, slowly and without any real ceremony, to rebuild something smaller than what we had lost. Not the relationship of a father and the son he once believed in without question, but something more honest, built one small, unremarkable Sunday phone call at a time. Leo is the piece of this story I think about most, even now, on the quiet evenings when the house is still, and the burnt orange light comes through the windows the way it did in that cemetery so many months ago, the way it always seems to at the exact hour when I miss Eleanor most. He was not responsible for the sins of the adults who made him. He never asked to be a pawn in a decades-old deception, and I refused, absolutely refused, to let him inherit the consequences of a lie he never told, a debt he never signed for. I met with him alone on a bench in the small garden Eleanor had planted behind our old house, the one I had, in the end, bought back from the estate sale, simply because I could not stand the thought of strangers walking through her roses, pulling up the very hydrangeas she had fussed over every spring for 30 years. I told him the truth, all of it, as gently as truth that heavy can ever be told, watching his face carefully with every sentence, ready to stop if he needed me to. I watched something in his young face fracture, and then, slowly, over the better part of an hour, begin to rebuild itself into something steadier, something more honest than the life he'd been handed without his consent. He asked me, at one point, in a voice much smaller than his usual one, whether this meant I loved him any less. I told him without a moment's hesitation that it meant exactly the opposite, that the boy sitting beside me on that bench had never once been anything other than entirely, unquestionably mine, in every way that had ever actually mattered. You don't carry my blood, I told him, but blood was never really the thing that mattered most in this family, Leo. Loyalty is. Character is. Your grandmother used to say, the truest test of a man isn't what he's handed, but what he builds with his own two hands when nobody's watching. I did not disown him. I did not, as some in my position might have, treat his existence as one more betrayal to punish. Instead, I established an education trust in his name, generous but conditioned on effort, on grades maintained, on a part-time job held throughout his years at university. Not a gift, an invitation, a chance for a boy who had done nothing wrong to prove, entirely on his own terms, exactly the kind of man he intended to become. You don't have to earn my love, I told him, the last thing I said before we left that garden together that afternoon, the last of the daylight fading gold across the roses. But you deserve the chance to earn your own respect. That's worth more than anything I could ever simply hand you for free. He hugged me then, the way he used to when he was small enough to ride on my shoulders through the park on summer evenings, and for the first time since I had buried Eleanor, I let myself cry. Not from grief this time, but from something much closer to relief. I rebuilt what needed rebuilding. Every director wrongfully terminated was reinstated within the month. With back pay and a personal apology, I delivered myself, in person, to each and every one of them, sitting across from them in their own kitchens, if that was what it took to say it properly. Patricia Alden cried again on the day I reinstated her, though this time she told me it was for a different reason entirely. The $12 million stolen from the pension fund was fully restored, not through insurance, not through some abstracted corporate mechanism that would have let me hide behind a spreadsheet, but from my own personal holdings, liquidated without hesitation, because the people who had trusted Sterling Horizon with their retirements had trusted Eleanor's name, and I was not about to let that trust become one more casualty of other people's greed. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning, nearly a year after I had stood at Eleanor's grave in that burnt orange light, I gathered the company's senior leadership in the very boardroom where everything had unraveled, and announced the final terms of my revised estate plan. The plan Eleanor and I had always meant to build together, before grief and betrayal had rewritten our timeline for us without our permission. 50% of Sterling Horizon Holdings would be converted into an employee stock ownership structure. The men and women who had poured their careers into these buildings finally holding a real, tangible stake in the empire their labor had built. No longer just names on a payroll, but true owners of what they had helped create. The remaining 50% would fund a new architectural scholarship, established in Eleanor's name, for young designers from working-class backgrounds who had more vision than resources, the exact kind of student Eleanor herself had once been, sketching skylines on legal pads in a rented room because she couldn't yet afford anything better. I stood at the ribbon cutting for the first scholarship recipient's debut project 8 months later, a small community library, modest in scale but honest in its craftsmanship, exactly the kind of building Eleanor would have loved, the kind she used to say mattered more than any glass tower, because it was where a child might first fall in love with a book. And I thought about how strange grief is, how it can hollow you out entirely, and then, if you let it, teach you exactly what is worth rebuilding in its place. Leo stood beside me that afternoon, holding a pair of ceremonial scissors nearly as large as his forearm, grinning the exact same grin he used to wear as a boy hunched over his grandmother's drafting table, and I understood, watching him, that some things really had survived after all. Family, I have come to understand, in the years since that terrible autumn, is not a matter of shared blood or a signature on a birth certificate. It is a matter of who stays when staying costs something. It is Eleanor's mustard yellow notebook, rescued from a wastebasket and now sitting permanently on my desk. A reminder that even the smallest, most unglamorous beginnings deserve to be protected from people who never understood their worth in the first place. Kindness, I learned the hard way, is not the same thing as weakness. A man can open his home, his company, and his heart to the people he loves, and still refuse, absolutely, unflinchingly refuse, to let that love be mistaken for permission to steal from him. If you have ever had to look someone you loved in the eye and finally see the truth of who they really were, if you've ever had to choose your own dignity over someone else's comfortable lie, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this one meant something to you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Because sometimes the most profound act of love a person can offer isn't forgiveness, freely given. It's the courage to close a door and the wisdom to know eventually which ones are worth opening again.